The Vatican's new doctrinal watchdog is explaining how the, quote, recent magisterium differs from, the non-recent magisterium. Join us with the latest from the Eternal City, Church Militant's Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomes. Jules, Archbishop and soon-to-be Cardinal Víctor Manuel Fernández is taking over the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, and he's saying he'll be upholding the, quote, recent magisterium, meaning the past 10 years. But Vatican veteran Ed Pentin kind of cornered him a little bit and asked him, of course, how this recent magisterium differs from the non-recent magisterium that organically developed for the past 2,000 years. Can you tell us about it?
Brad, Víctor Manuel Fernández actually took over 2 days ago, and he is now the prefect of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. The reason Ed Pentin asked him this question, because it has become customary for a number of people pushing the progressive agenda to talk about the Francis magisterium as if it differs, for example, from the John Paul II magisterium. And Pentin asked him this very direct question. Now, Fernandez's response was a masterpiece in diplomatic doublespeak. So on the one hand, he has elements that we would commend him for and say, well, this is classic Catholic teaching. On the other hand, he throws in, stuff that would cause one to raise one's eyebrow. So, for example, he speaks of obedience to the magisterium, 10 out of 10. He talks about a static deposit of faith delivered once for all to the saints. We all agree with that. But then he talks about how the Pope has a unique charism to preserve this deposit of faith, which is fine, which the Lord has given only to Peter and his successors, and only Francis has this. Now, he goes on to qualify this. It's not merely safeguarding. It's not merely being a custodian, but he describes Peter's, that is Francis's office, as a living and active gift, which is at work in the person of the Holy Father. I do not have this charism, nor do you, nor does Cardinal Burke. Notice the swipe at Cardinal Burke. Today, only Pope Francis has it. And then he goes on to say, if some bishops think that they have the authority to judge or critique what the Holy Spirit is doing through Pope Francis, we will enter into a vicious circle where anybody can claim to have the true doctrine, and that would be heresy and schism. Now, he says, remember, heretics always think they know the true doctrine of the Church. Unfortunately, today, not only do some progressives fall into this error, but also, paradoxically, do some traditionalist groups.
Well, we'd all agree it's true that the Pope has the charism of infallibility when he chooses to exercise it, and we need to obey the magisterium, and the Pope must guard the non-recent magisterium, which he calls the static deposit of faith. Kudos to him for mentioning the deposit of faith. Some bishops may not uphold that. But where do you think this focus is on this living and active gift? Why is he pushing that so much?
Well, I've read this more than once, and the thought and discussed this with, quite a few people. And we talked about how this almost borders on some founder of a cult, like the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons, or even, the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, who suddenly claim that they have a new revelation, and therefore they have the right to build up on the so-called deposit of faith. And that can be very dangerous, particularly if you say that nobody else can judge what, Pope Francis is claiming to be his unique revelation from the Holy Spirit. And, the church has never done theology or doctrine like this. And particularly at a time when Pope Francis is talking about synodality and collegiality and listening to the whole church, that his doctrinal Rottweiler should talk like this is very, very, unsettling, to say the least.
Well, I guess all of us as Catholics have, Catholic ears to hear, so we would filter everything through what we already understand, that truth can't change. The public revelation was closed, with the death of the last apostle. We have the deposit of faith, so everything we have is organically built on that. So we always have to understand everything in that light. So I don't really understand the tremendous emphasis, or all of a sudden now, like you say, there's some, if there's true new revelation coming out. So anyway, let's move on to another question here. Pentin also asked him about the issue of the lack of clarity, which, my goodness, I guess we'd all agree on, not just in this Francis papacy here, but in the church teaching over the past 60 years, we've been really having a problem with that. Many, Burke and Mueller and other people have talked about that. What did Fernandez say when questioned about the lack of clarity?
Now, this is, again, a very interesting question, and he gives a very slippery response. He immediately shifts the goalpost, and he responds saying that debates and therefore some lack of clarity had existed throughout the history of the church. He talks about the debates, among the fathers on very critical issues. And of course, he's right, because even in councils, I'm reading John O'Malley's History on the Council of Trent, a great book by the Jesuit priest. And there were fierce debates in settling doctrine even within the council, because different orders, Franciscans and Dominicans, took different positions, for example, on the doctrine of justification by faith. However, when the church finally pronounces doctrine, she does so with great clarity and great precision. And that was the question. We do not seem to be receiving this clarity in teaching, in proclamation. And he completely moves the goalposts and talks about debates, and lack of clarity in debate. But the debates are held because the church desires to arrive at clarity. And so his response is a total red herring.
Yeah, I mean, we don't try to confuse people just to get them to start discussing things. That's not exactly a pastoral approach, although it seems like that's kind of a goal here, to have what you might even call yellow journalism coming from the Vatican, just to stir up the discussion or gin up the discussion. Asked about the German synodal way. He gives kind of, you go ahead and let us know this German synodal way. I mean, he's coming in, he took over 2 days ago. He didn't brush up on anything. What does he say about the German synodal way when he's asked about it?
Well, if he was, a top executive in a corporate firm, this answer would have got him sacked. Because the German synodal way is throwing the most, is creating the biggest crisis in the church since, probably the 16th century. And this crisis is caused by doctrinal disobedience that is taking various so-called pastoral forms. And if the incoming head of the Vatican's doctrinal watchdog says that, well, I'm not too well informed when this information is available in every single media outlet, that's rather, again, very, very disappointing or very dodgy indeed.
Yeah, so he comes in, he's asked about, he said, well, I'm not too well informed about all that. It's like, do you ever watch anything on, social media, read any newspapers? It's been going on for years now, and it's really coming to a head. I just over the top how you could just say I'm not too well informed on something like that. Asked about his previously stated openness to same-sex blessings. What was his response there?
Again, he simply ducked the question. He said, I was referring to confusing a same-sex union with marriage. And he says, it's clear that the church, at this point, note these three important words, Brad, at this point, it is clear that the church only understands marriage as an indissoluble union between a man and a woman who, in their differences, are naturally open to beget life. So at some point, we might evolve and develop this doctrine and understand marriage differently.
And amazing. Well, we know that Christ's church will always preserve truth. We know the Pope alone has the charism infallibility, doesn't stretch to somebody like Fernandez, and only when he's definitively teaching faith and morals to the universal church, or when all the bishops gather together in union with him and do so. But that doesn't mean every shepherd is always going to make the most prudential judgment. Prudential judgments are going to be always infallible or impeccable. Doesn't mean he's always going to do the right thing, enforce the right policies. But trust Christ to keep his church on track after 2,000 years. He hasn't let us down yet. Jules, thank you so much for keeping us up to speed on what's going on in the Eternal City.
Thank you, Brad.